and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Rida Fakhri. The international effort to prepare for what happens if Syria's government collapses is gathering momentum. The United Nations has been working on different scenarios to stabilise Syria, particularly if the Assad government should fall. Now, the UN always anticipated playing a humanitarian role, but it is also working on several contingency plans for peacekeeping. Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor, James Bays, has more.
Here inside the UN building, there are teams that are working on planning on the future of Syria. Many of those plans, and there are a wide range of options that are being debated, are secret, but they all come under the overall heading for these plans, Syria the day after. The planning is being coordinated by Ban Ki-moon's own deputy, a former foreign minister of Sweden.
We are thinking of and planning for the day after, and we hope that that day after will come very soon. But of course there are many uncertain factors. The result of the crisis that we're having, both the warfare and of course the humanitarian crisis, and the wounds that are left if this continues, if this crisis continues. About 5-6 months ago, our day after planning was mostly to what degree we could help restore institutions, help out with institution building, help out with the reconciliation processes and the work of the United Nations Development Programme. But I must admit, now the focus is more on a concern of what state of affairs we will have to deal with at the end of this conflict, because the conflict has developed to such a degree that we see grave risks of a wave of revenge and continued strife, maybe of a different quality, but equally serious.
The UN knows that at any point there could be a decisive event that changes things very quickly. The UN, though, is not able to respond that quickly because any operation on the ground would require the authorization of the UN Security Council. It's not just the UN who are doing planning for the future of Syria and the possibility of a future without Assad. Western political leaders remain very reluctant to get involved, but their military planners are looking at all the options in case at the last minute they get orders handed down from on high. I can tell you some US units recently have been doing chemical warfare training. In the region itself, Turkey is looking at all options. I'm told Turkish generals have plans to go into Syria if they deem that necessary. Israel reluctant to enter Syria, but I'm told that if necessary, if they feel that Israel's security was threatened, the generals there are planning buffer zones inside Syria and possibly going back into the south of Lebanon.
To discuss the UN contingency plans and what they may mean for Syria and the region, we're joined by our three guests. In Oklahoma City, Joshua Landis, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and Associate Professor at the University of Oklahoma. In London, Yazan Abdallah, a Syrian academic. He's also a member of the Syria Dialogue, which is a group calling for transitional change in Syria. And here in the studio, we're joined by Saleh Mubarak, a member of the Syrian National Council. Welcome to you all. Saleh Mubarak, the UN has been working on various contingency plans for a while now, since last year. It is relatively easy, though, isn't it, to draw up all sorts of plans sitting in conference rooms, but just how realistic, how implementable are any of these plans given the fluidity, the complexity and the unpredictability of the situation inside Syria?
First of all, I would say that the international community and the United Nations in particular has a moral and legal obligation to protect the civilians in Syria. This has been going on for a long time, initiative after initiative, Kofi Annan, Lakhdar al-Brahimi, General Mood, and so on. Let's remember one thing. Every day we wait, there's about 150 innocent Syrians die because of this brutal regime. And we demanded many times that we need an action from the United Nations or even outside the United Nations that will end this bloodshed. And it will not end except with the complete removal of this regime.
Well, you talk about the UN's and the international community's moral obligation, but what about Syrians themselves? Who is going to run the country if and when the Syrian government in Damascus falls? The coalition, the national coalition, is in shambles. You do not have one single recognized political leadership, not a unified political vision, and certainly no authority, it would seem, over all of the scattered military-armed rebel groups inside the country. Who is going to run Syria the day after?
Well, I don't think the coalition is in shambles, like you mentioned. Remember, in the conference that was held in Morocco, more than 100 countries around the world recognized the coalition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people.
Yes, but the head of the coalition recently resigned.
Well,
you have no control over the military rebel movement inside the country. You have recently elected a prime minister who's a Texas-based entrepreneur, and as soon as his name was announced, Brigadier General Idris, the nominal head of the Free Syrian Army, rejected his leadership.
I did not hear of this rejection. However, the plan is to have a temporary government, and they're still in deliberation about they announced today, in fact, that it will include 11 ministers, key ministries that will focus on services to the people in the liberated areas, as well as leading the effort towards the goal, which is the removal of the regime. I think we are in a good position to start this temporary, some people call it transitional. It's not transitional, it's temporary until the fall of the regime. Once the regime falls, then we are going to start a transitional stage, which will lead eventually to the permanent stage, which elections will take place.
Yes, and Abdallah, Saleh Mubarak says we are in a good position. The military situation remains fluid, no doubt, but rebel forces have made considerable gains over recent months. Some would even argue that the rebellion has now entered its final stage, which is the battle for Damascus. We know that over the last few weeks, as many as 160 cargo flights have carried weapons to the rebels through Turkey and Jordan. Just how much longer can Assad's government survive?
Thank you. I don't think the fact that the struggle has been protracted means that the balance has been tipped. We know that the NATO has recently clearly announced its new stance, or reaffirmed its stance, that it is not going to interfere in Syria. Also, France backtracked from its position that it was considering arming the rebels with heavy weapons. And without external support, it's very difficult for the rebels to make any sweeping victory. Yes, there have been talks about Damascus battle, but maybe in every struggle there's a sort of a Stalingrad scenario, where maybe if they go into the battle without enough weapons, maybe this is going to be of a counter effect back on them. It's very difficult to see that the rebels going into Damascus will make them achieve any military progress.
But is the post-Assad scenario, though, now looking increasingly inevitable? And who will fill the vacuum if and when it happens? Will Syrians need the United Nations to step in with some kind of a peacekeeping contingency plan? And are you likely to have the deployment of peacekeepers if the Security Council is still divided?
Well, I think talking about post-Assad Syria is part of the chaos of terminology, as I would call it. It's exactly like when we talk about moderate rebels, or exactly like when we talk about non-lethal weapons. I think these concepts need to be qualified, because this is almost driving the audience to believe that this is almost an inevitability. Whilst the world powers and the international community remains divided towards the best solution for Syria. We know that the BRICS countries have recently reaffirmed the stance towards Syria for a Syrian-led political process. Now, why don't we talk about post-Qaeda Syria? For example, terrorism now is the most burning issue in Syria, and it is one that it is threatening Syrian, regional and international security and stability. So I think the most important discussion to take place is post-radicalization. How can we solve radicalizing Syria quite immediately and on the long term?
But before we get to that point, if we simply look at what may or may not befall the government in Damascus, Joshua Landis, you know Syria extremely well. How does the picture appear like to you? Just how timely, how appropriate is it to talk about a post-Assad Syria?
Well, I think we're not anywhere near a post-Assad Syria. Yes, the battle for Damascus is beginning, but the problem is that the Alawite community and others who back this government are in this for the duration, and they're going to fight like mad. And Damascus is likely to get destroyed unless there's some, intervention from the outside. Because if once the Syrian military that supports Assad is pushed out of Damascus, they're going to fall back, of course, to the coast where their families are. And if they're driven out of that, and one assumes they'll be in some chaos by that time, you will see the Alawite community run away. They're not going to wait to see whether these militias, which have not been taking prisoners in the past, are going to be kind to them or not kind to them. They're going to run to Lebanon, which is an hour away from any Alawite village, really, in the mountains. That's about 3 million Alawites who are going to storm into Lebanon, much like the Christians left Anatolia during the First World War, where over 3 million Christians were either killed or expelled from Turkey.
Some may flee
that's
for
the
fear,
danger.
some may
when
flee
you contemplate
for fear of retribution. But are you also talking about the possibility of the fragmentation of Syria along sectarian lines? And where does the United States stand on this? How keen is the U.S. to see President Assad gone? Because some would argue that it is in the U.S.'s interest and in the interest of its allies, certainly Israel, to see this regime bloodied and weakened for as long as possible.
Well, I think it's in the, people want to see Assad go. The question is, what happens once he goes? Because if there's a total win by the rebels, the Alawites are going to flee. They're not going to wait to see whether people are kind to them, because they're not going to be kind. And this disruption is going to go in waves. There are many stages yet to go in a civil war. And that's the problem, is nobody can see what the end game really is. And it scares everybody. United States, one of the things about talking about a post-Assad Syria is the United States has never had an interest in Syria as itself. It's only had an interest in Syria because of Israel. It's been Hamas and Hezbollah. The U.S. has had sanctions since the 70s. The notion that the United States is going to pay a lot of money or get deeply involved in Syria, I think, is misleading, because Syria is not important to the United States. And that's why I think Obama has been so reluctant to get in. And we know now, the latest reports say that the average American family is in debt $40,000 for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans are angry about this. They're very upset because they're getting poorer. And they do not want their government to get involved in peacekeeping forces, in a civil war that's going to suck them in and cost a lot of money. And that's the terrible news for the Syrians, I think, is that the world is beleaguered and they haven't had a deep interest in Syria.
Saleh Mubarak, how do you then manage when, as you see, the West, the United States, aren't interested in being sucked in, given all of the financial and other problems that are going on in the world? How do you do it on your own? How do you do it as a largely foreign-based opposition movement, as I said, hardly united? How do you rein in those militias, those armed rebels roaming around Damascus, not Damascus, but Syria in general? How do you rein them in, and how do you actually assert your own authority?
Well, I wish that the United States, as Joshua said, I wish it was neutral to this. We don't want any financial support from the United States or involvement, direct involvement of boots on the ground. No, we want them to stay neutral in allowing us to obtain what we want to attain in order to win this battle.
But you are getting financial support from others, from some regional powers. And in fact, Mu'azz al-Khatib, the head of the National Coalition, resigned when he said some red lines were crossed. And he talked about foreign interference.
Well, yes, we are getting from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, from Qatar, from even the United States announced that it has contributed like $200 and something million. I don't know what that contribution could have gone to humanitarian missions.
But doesn't this ultimately weaken your domestic appeal? Doesn't it make you beholden to some of these regional powers who will increasingly want to set their own terms?
We are now, as opposition, we are, yes, there are some pressures from here and there, but we're trying to stay focused. And the most important thing to us is to rally behind the new leadership. And you mentioned earlier that the potential chaos in Syria after the collapse of Assad, I'm not as pessimistic as Mr. Landis. I believe the Syrian people, yes, there are emotions running high now, but if you go back to the history of Syrians through 2,000 years, we're very moderate people, very tolerant to others, and even the 3 million Christians that he mentioned, where did they flee after World War I? They fled to Syria.
But those doing the fighting today certainly aren't the moderate elements.
Right. My point is, it's our aim and the obligation of the world powers to strengthen the moderate leadership of the opposition, and that will directly weaken the other fringe elements that are radicals.
Well, the more radical elements that you talk about will feel more entitled to power than you do, because they will argue that they made the sacrifices, they put up the fight. Why should they be pushed aside?
I know a lot of things on the ground, and I know that many of those Salafi groups and jihadist groups and so on, the soldiers in these are neither Salafi nor jihadi. They're normal Syrians. They barely probably pray 5 times. They may not, they may whatever. But the reason they join those groups is because those groups are well financed, and they have money pouring in and weapons. So if I want to join a group, and that I'm looking for a group that can give me a machine gun, an RPG, or weapons that is well financed, I may grow a beard and pretend to be a Salafi in order to join those. But
well, you just said it. They represent all these competing regional and international dynamics. Let me put this question to Yazan Abdallah. The conflict as it is now, certainly the battle for Damascus, will this be the easier phase of this rebellion? I mean, when Damascus does eventually fall, are we likely to see a continuation of this conflict, perhaps this conflict taking a turn for the worst, with some of these armed groups fighting each other? And we have reports today that suggest that some of these rebels are stocking up on ammunition, knowing that they will one day use them against each other.
The question implies that Damascus is inevitably going to fall. It's not a question of when Damascus falls. The question is, will it? And that takes us back to the argument that Mr. Landis put forward, that in which he tried to give the struggle in Syria a pure sectarian strife. It is not purely against the Alawites and the Christians, as Mr. Landis always tries to portray the conflict in Syria. It's a little more complex. Now, people in Damascus are from a majority of from the Sunni sect, and those Sunnis are from a moderate background. That's why they still, until now, aren't at all convinced in the insurgency. So people have seen from the very start the sectarian strife nature to the violence, and they did not believe that this is a revolution as much as it is an insurgency powered almost completely by Islamist groups. We know that
let's talk about this challenge that the Islamist groups, as you say, would represent certainly today. Joshua Landis, how do you deal then with groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, groups that have empowered themselves militarily? How do you wrest control away from them? How do you eventually rein them in?
Well, first let me address this sectarian issue. Ghazan Abdallah is absolutely right. This is not only a sectarian war, although that is, I think, a very important part of it. It is also a class war, and it's a war of little factions against other factions. And we saw the class war play out in Aleppo. About hundreds of factories around Aleppo have been stripped and sold off. All those upper class people are out of the country. Syria represents a golden opportunity for Salafists and jihadists to try to construct an Islamic state. Unlike Iraq, which fell into the hands of the Shiites, and the Sunnis, couldn't establish Syria is the opportunity. It is a Sunni state where it could be set up with Islam. Now, I don't believe it will be. I think that as your spokesperson for the SNC said, Syria has traditionally been a moderate country. Syrians love to smoke, they love to dance, they love to have fun, and they're not going to allow people to keep them from doing those things. But those groups are going to fight very hard. They are getting radical. They are getting lots of money. And the only three countries that are really interested in Syria are the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, of course, which has some money, and Turkey. And they are going to fight over this. They're going to fund these people. And as your commentators have already said, the Saudis and the Gulf people are the ones who are sending money in. And that's why the Salafist groups have a lot of power and arms. And that's not going to go away, because those donors have a lot at stake in trying to see Syria created in the vision of Islam. Now, I don't think Syrians want that. And they will, when things calm down, I think moderation will prevail. But right now, they need the radicals in order to win this war, because the radicals are the best fighters, they're the best organized, and they have the most experience.
All right, well, let's put this point first to Saleh Mubarak. We'll then move on to Yazan Abdallah as well. For a reaction, how do you avoid this doomsday scenario? How do you make sure that Syria doesn't become a country divided along these sectarian and ideological lines between Salafis and secularists and other powers?
Well, I have a simple solution, but of course it's simple to mention, and I don't know how simple it is to apply on the ground. We have to rally behind the leadership, which is now the temporary government, which will have the military leadership under it.
But which
and
leadership? Which leadership are we talking about?
The Free Syrian Army, which now is going, I know it's fractured, but it has to be, there should be one leadership. And you mentioned General Salim Idris, and that's the leadership we recognize.
And he rejects the political leadership that you represent?
I don't know. We have to come up with something, because we cannot simply strip the legitimacy from General Idris that we have given him before, but we have to come up with a solution that will unify the military leadership and the political leadership, and then after that we would declare that any group that works outside the umbrella of this leadership is not recognized, and any aid, any help, whether it's military or financial, has to come through that one legal channel. And before, just let me mention one example. About 20 years ago, when the Bosnian War was going on, there was also radical groups, there was jihadists, there was all kind of things. When Bosnia got the independence, everyone thought, oh, those will not go and they will keep fighting. And somehow the late President Alija Izetbegovic was able to deal with them in a way that will kept the power in the government hands and solve that peacefully. And we are hopeful to reach an agreement. And when
but reach an agreement with whom? Because you talk about the importance of strengthening quote-unquote moderate groups, yet you as a national coalition and council reject the idea of entering into any kind of dialogue with anyone who advocates discussion, negotiation with the government in Damascus. Let me put this point to Yazan Abdallah. What kind of solution do you as a Syrian see for this situation, for this kind of deadlock?
Thank you. Before I come to the solution, there is one fact that is very important to clarify. When we talk about FSA, FSA is not an organization, or it's not a hierarchy as it is sometimes portrayed. FSA is a term that it is used as a database for all the jihadists and extreme Islamist fighters now in the Syrian crisis. So this is very important to clarify. When we talk about rallying behind political entities, by all means, everybody in a democratic Syria has the right to rally behind the ones that they believe that they aspire for the appropriate future of Syria. Now, if you look at the approach of the coalition or the SNC, they have from the start disenfranchised all Syrians inside Syria and so almost confiscated the future of Syria and put only forward their views as exclusive. So this contradicts with any concept of democracy. Now, as for the solution from day one has been known to all Syrians that it should be an inclusive process of political dialogue with no preconditions for all Syrians to come to the table and sit down and discuss. Then it's all down to the ballot boxes. And only by elections, Syrians will decide what type of government will govern Syria in future and what ruler will, which ruler will rule Syria.
Thanks to all our guests. In Oklahoma, Joshua Landis. In London, Yazan Abdallah. And here in the studio, Saleh Mubarak. And thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive coverage of what's going on in Syria, not just on this program, but with our news programs as well. And, of course, online at aljazeera.com. From Miri Dafakhri and the team, thanks for joining us.